work has been covered by the Wall Street Journal and the Economist, and today he's going to talk about the architecture of understanding. From across the pond, please give a very warm welcome to Peter Morville.
Thanks for that introduction. Hopefully the mic is working. Is it? Okay. Folks in the back here, give me a hands up if you can hear. Yeah, great, excellent. Okay, for speakers, future speakers at this conference, if you're speaking here next year, be very careful of the stories you tell at dinner the night before. All right, so I'd like to begin with a warning. This is a non-linear talk with twists and turns and strange connections. You may get lost. You may feel a little sick. But that's okay for a couple of reasons. First, you won't suffer long. I've kept this talk short so that there's time for questions and conversation. Second, at a time when it's all too easy to be comfortably numb, we have to summon the courage to slow down, to explore the structure beneath the surface, and to dwell in discomfort in search of understanding. So in other words, I want you to be uncomfortable. And by the way, I'm well aware that I'm the only thing that stands between you and a beer. So at this point, you might be wondering, who is this sadistic speaker? Let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll dive right in. You wouldn't know this from my accent, but I was born in Manchester, which is home to what was once the country's largest library. This explains why I went into an academic career in library and information science. I went through the University of Michigan's graduate program in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which was mentioned earlier today. But I've never really worked in a library because I'm one of those crazy librarians who fell in love with the internet in the early 1990s. Since that time, I've spent my career outside the walls of the traditional library, working as a consultant, helping a diverse collection of organizations with their information architecture and user experience challenges. Along the way, I've written a number of animal books about information architecture and findability and search. And then there's my latest creation, Intertwingled, which is a book about everything. Or to be precise, it's about how everything is connected from code to culture. The book's divided into 5 chapters: nature, categories, connections, culture, and limits. And so is this talk. I wrote Intertwingled because we're reaching the limits of the industrial age mindset. The perception of companies as machines is holding us back. Organizations are ecosystems. They're not apart from, but a part of nature. This is an inconvenient truth that makes us uncomfortable, so we ignore it. We let ourselves be seduced by the surface at the expense of understanding. I was working with a Fortune 500 a year or so back, a company that does $2 billion a year in online sales. And as we were walking down the hall, my client said to me, "We keep hiring consultants every few years to come in and clean up our site to help us get organized. And as soon as they leave, we start messing it all up again. We keep making the same mistakes." Now this sort of bothered me because it's not my goal in life to skate along the surface. I want to go deep and make lasting change in the organizations I work with. So I started looking for cracks in the ice. I found one in men's clothing. In the evaluation of the website, my first task I assigned myself was to find the t-shirts. But I couldn't. I scanned down the list, chose shirts, and they were missing. To find them, I had to use Google. Now later, I was able to talk to the woman who hid the t-shirts. She said that her organization was decentralized like a traditional department store, each merchandiser was encouraged to experiment. They were giving a lot of freedom. And about a year before, she'd moved T-shirts up a level in the taxonomy. Sales increased, so she deemed it a success. Now, I explained that the sales bump was likely due to SEO, that moving it up in the taxonomy had made T-shirts more findable via Google, but in the process, she had made it almost impossible to find T-shirts for folks who were already in the website. I also noted that this is the web, and she could put T-shirts in more than one place at once. This was on a Friday. By Monday morning, T-shirts were listed at both levels of the taxonomy. Kind of surprising to see them move so quickly, and I figure I earned my consulting fee with that one single change. But of course, the case of the missing T-shirts was only a symptom. To find the root cause, we had to look deeper, from the website to the org chart. Dividing organizations into silos with specialists, as they had done, has obvious value, but it also has hidden costs. That's the problem with reductionism. We optimize the parts at the expense of the whole, and we don't even know what we're missing. This is the elephant in the website that we all ignore so well. To improve the user experience, we're going to have to wrangle with culture and governance. But that's hard and scary, so we look away and crash right into the iceberg. Now, the Titanic has been a symbol in our culture for a long time. I remember as a young child in England, learning all about the Titanic from my grandfather. It's been a symbol for so long because it's not just ships that have a hard time changing course. Software, for instance, is surprisingly resistant to change. That's why we're all still buying books and movies on a clunky application called iTunes. Now, one shift that can help is to change our minds about planning. There's obvious value in agile and lean methods and the notion of the minimum viable product. But it's risky to proceed without a plan. I worry that we are de-emphasizing the importance of planning. Let me illustrate that with a story. Last year, I went backpacking in Isle Royale National Park. It's a beautiful, rugged island in the northwest corner of Lake Superior. This was my first time doing real backpacking and camping out in the wilderness. And it's interesting to note that the line between inspiration and planning is blurry. I mean, one day I was reading books about hiking the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail, and I was thinking, those people are crazy. I would never do that. And the next day, I'm buying a tent. Now, I did a lot of traditional planning. I made a list and I checked it twice. But planning is also about playing and practicing. I did that too. In the backyard, I burned my fingers with the pocket stove. Then I learned how to use tinfoil to protect the flame from the wind. And in the bathtub, I played with my water filter. Because with respect to learning by failure, it's all fun and games until someone gets a larval cyst in their brain. So all too often, we split ideas and execution into phases or roles. We draw lines in our minds that segregate. The binary oppositions of think, do, and plan, build are myths. Like yin and yang, they're entangled. You can't do one without the other. Dualism is popular because it's simple, but that's also precisely why it fails. So at this point in the evolution of the internet, we're all skeptical of anything attributed to Albert Einstein. But that's okay, because this quote is really about us. In both understanding and communication, too simple versus too complex is a universal struggle. It's something that we wrangle with every day. I was first drawn to Isle Royale by the study of its ecosystem. Its wolves and moose are the subjects of the longest continuous study of prey-predator relations in the world. At first, the scientists expected their populations to rise and fall predictably and to maintain the balance of nature. But that's not what happened at all. Externalities like weather and disease caused wild, unpredictable changes in their populations. In short, the model was wrong. They didn't understand their ecosystem, and neither do we. Our models and our metrics are far too simple. That's why we keep making the same mistakes. Fortunately, there's a better way to think about complex adaptive systems. It's called systems thinking, and it dates back to at least the 1950s. Some very smart people designed a visual language to map complexity. And that's part of the problem. For most folks, most of the time, these models are far too complex. They may be useful for analysis, but they're terrible for communication because they make people's brains explode. Now, to close this first chapter, let's go back to the start. When I began my career, I saw business as a machine. Reductionism made sense, and I specialized in the design and management of information systems. But over the years, I've come to see that organizations are ecosystems, literally, and that if we hope to affect lasting change, we have to work harder to understand the nature of information in systems. Okay, new chapter. Let's talk about classification and its consequences. Now, everyone knows that information architects design taxonomies and navigation systems. And if you've read the wonderful book, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things by George Lakoff, you know why we bring the basic level categories to the surface. Users may never click on browse by topic. They don't really know what it means. That's why we bring out the polar bear cubs. People respond much better to the meaningful labels in the middle of a taxonomy, at the middle level of a hierarchy. So information architects do delve into psycholinguistics. It's pretty heavy stuff. But I think our work with categories doesn't go nearly deep enough. Because categories are the cornerstones of cognition and culture. They shape how we think more than we know. Our default is the bounded set. There's a clear boundary. Things are in or out. It's us or them. We use it because it's easy, but that doesn't make it right. In fact, most sets are actually fuzzy. They have a center and a periphery, but no clear boundary. We think we can define things easily until we can't. Then there's the centered set, invented by Paul Hebert in 1978. His work as a missionary in India left him frustrated by the traditional rules of inclusion and exclusion surrounding Christianity. So he proposed a more dynamic way to form categories by defining a center and by paying more attention to direction than location. So in his model, a Christian is anyone who moves towards Christ. There's a wonderful scene in the life of Pi in which young Pi is told he can't be a Hindu, a Christian, and a Muslim. It's impossible. He must choose. In response, Pi blurts out, "But Gandhi said all religions are true. I just want to love God. Sometimes we must choose which story we prefer, but not always. All too often, we use radio buttons when checkboxes or sliders might reveal the truth. We do it to our users, and we do it to ourselves. Okay, let's jump from categories to connections in space, but also in time. So back in the day, information architects designed links between pages to make websites. Then mobile and cross-channel led us towards a more medium-independent definition of what we do. We're placemakers. We make paths and places across digital and physical spaces. We've learned that most organizations must embrace both a multi-channel solution, for instance, a responsive website that delivers the same content and features across multiple platforms and devices, and a broader cross-channel strategy that weaves together physical and digital touch points into a coherent user experience. For the most part, it's not either or, but both and. Of course, our work also operates on a deeper level by shaping categories and connections in the minds of our users and clients and colleagues. Our focus tends to be spatial, but we should also be thinking about time. We should use our expertise to map and model actions and reactions and consequences. Let me give you an example. I was working with a philanthropic foundation on a website redesign a few years back. When I talked with the stakeholders, they were unanimous in saying that the primary goal of the site was to help grant seekers to find funding. So I talked with a lot of grant seekers, their end users. And they pretty much unanimously said, it's really hard to find that information on this website because it's fragmented by program. It health and human services and education and the environment, arts and culture, all grants and funding in different areas. So I suggested that we create an apply for grants page, a single page that brought all of this key data, all of these deadlines and calendars together into a single table. And it was a huge hit. It very quickly became the second most visited page after the home page. But then someone on the board of trustees stumbled across this page, and they didn't like the picture that it showed of the organization because more than half of the programs were invite only, sort of a don't call us, we'll call you. Now, the initial knee-jerk reaction was to just pull the page. Right? We don't like this picture, so let's just get rid of it. But fortunately, the wiser minds prevailed. And what this did is it triggered a series of strategic conversations throughout the foundation where they realized we're shifting our strategy from anybody can apply for funding to we've got the specialists in the field, they're learning about their communities, and they know who needs and deserves the funding. And so that caused a complete questioning of the stated strategy of the website and now another redesign of the site. So there's an interesting sort of ripple effect caused by a single page. This would come as a surprise to systems thinking folks because they know the system always kicks back. And in fact, it's when you get a knife in your back that you know you're making progress. Now, if you really want to understand what's going on in organizations, I recommend reading Carl Weick. This question, how can I know what I think until I see what I say, is just the tip of the iceberg. It hints at embodied cognition and extended mind and what Weick calls retrospective sense-making. the notion that we act first, wait for a response, and then explain to ourselves and others why we acted in the first place. This adds a twist to the notion of the minimum viable product because our actions are impossible to undo. This brings us to culture, which is like water to a fish, important and ubiquitous, but nearly impossible to see from the inside. Edgar Schein helps us to see culture by making a map. On the surface are the visible artifacts. You can walk into almost any organization and see what people are wearing and where they sit, how they interact in meetings. But this behavior is hard to interpret. To get at the why beneath the what, you have to ask people about their goals and strategies and values. You can learn a lot that way, but the problem is there's also a lot that they can't or won't tell you. To get to the truth, you've got to dig into history. Edgar Schein explains that during the early, difficult years of a startup, the founders rely on certain ways of thinking and doing. And if that startup survives, those values and behaviors become part of the organizational DNA. They become taken for granted. This is fine, except sometimes those ways of thinking and doing don't scale, or a shift in the environment may render them obsolete or even counterproductive. That's when we start talking about the need to change culture, which Edgar Schein warns us is much harder than we think. Hofstede is a little bit more optimistic. He argues that while national paradigms can't be changed, you can nudge organizational practices if you find the right lever. His book is wonderful if you want to sort of learn about the way that culture is layered from sort of national to organizational to subculture and the way that those layers interact. That said, it's really not easy, right, to change culture. We're generally willing to adjust our behavior based on feedback, to change our actions based on results, but we vigorously resist changing our beliefs. We're not very good as organizations or individuals at what Chris Argyris calls double loop learning. Now, I had my own encounter with double loop learning back in 2005 while I was writing the Lemur book, Ambient Findability. I was suffering from pretty severe chronic back pain. I went to the doctor. She prescribed 3 Advil 3 times a day and a lot of physical therapy. I followed doctor's orders, but my pain only got worse. In desperation, I went to Google, and I found this book by John Sarno, in which he argues that much chronic pain is psychosomatic and can be cured by our minds. First, I was skeptical. Who is this guy? Why should I trust him? Maybe it's just a scam to sell books. But it's not. This book healed my back, and it radically changed my beliefs about the mind-body connection. And once that crack appears in the ice, there's no going back. Read this book, Hippocrates' Shadow, and you'll see what I mean. I've become painfully aware of the gaping holes in Western medicine. Nassim Taleb says, if you want to accelerate someone's death, give him a personal doctor. I don't mean provide him with a bad doctor. Any doctor will do. He explains that our culture's predisposition towards naive intervention is extremely hazardous to our health. So how much power do we really have to change an organization and its culture? Well, That's the funny thing about limits. We don't know what they are until we hit them. And by the way, I've been assured by an expert that this snail can totally cross that gap. So let's talk about 5 ways to affect change: information, architecture, behavior, leadership, and synthesis, which involves creative ways of blending the first 4. In our culture, we tend to start with information. We tell people not to smoke. We give them data about the dangers of doctors and donuts. But of course, people are very good at ignoring information. Calvin Moores told us this back in 1959 when he said that people may not want information precisely, or people may avoid using a system precisely because it gives them information. But we mostly ignored him. So how else can we affect change? Well, Winston Churchill nailed it when he said, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." Changes to the architecture, to our surrounding environment, can nudge behavior in a very big way. We do a whole lot of nudging online. This default sort isn't user-centered, but it drives a lot of revenue. It's the folks who figured this out who can afford these homes. Before we mess with architecture and the environment, it's vital that we study the culture in question. And ethnography is among the best ways to dig deep. In the ethnographic interview by James Spradley, he explains how to ask the right questions in the right way. For instance, if you ask a homeless person if they have a home, they'll say no. But if you ask them to describe a day in their life, they may tell you about their flops, the places where they sleep and eat and keep their belongings. And you'll learn they're not really homeless after all. Everyone in UX should read this book and use its methods to map the cultures of both our users and our stakeholders. In short, we must map before we meddle. Now, it may also be worth intervening at the level of behavior, because as this book explains, the power of habit, changes in what they call keystone habits can have a ripple effect. For instance, when we start to exercise, the simple act of dragging our bodies out the door every day for a run builds the willpower muscle, which may then help us to quit smoking, to eat better, even to do our homework. Last but not least is leadership, which is hard. You don't change an organization just by being the boss. I'll explain with a story from my local public library. The director, Josie Parker, was hired, became a leader in the wake of a financial scandal that sort of rocked the community. It was her job to rebuild trust. She set about doing this by creating what she calls a culture of generosity. There have been visible artifacts of this approach, from the smallest things to the largest. For instance, we've been invited to play games that result in the waiving of library fines. Under her watch, they've constructed several new branch libraries, which are now some of the most beautiful buildings in Ann Arbor. There's a personal story in here, too. One Christmas, Josie volunteered to wrap presents at a local bookstore. They'd collected quite a lot of change for charity when a thief grabbed the tip jar and ran. Josie chased and tackled him. She fractured her leg in the process. The thief escaped but left the money. And this story made national news. It was on CNN with the headline, "The Librarian Who Saved Christmas." My point here is that sometimes a leader needs to act out an exaggerated version of their values in order to inspire people to tell the right stories, because stories are the currency of cultural change. So let's get back to limits. These are three of the most fascinating and depressing books I've ever read. They all point to the same inconvenient truth. We're living beyond our limits, and we're beginning to feel the consequences. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure if we can turn this ship around. As Jared Diamond showed in his book, Collapse, we humans are perfectly capable of sailing an entire civilization into an iceberg. So I'm not really an optimist, but I do have hope, and I think there are things we can do. For instance, there's this wonderful practice called river daylighting. In the past, as we built our cities, our rivers grew polluted, so we buried them. This worked for a while, but increasingly it's led to urban flooding, which was mentioned a little earlier today. But now a growing number of communities have begun mapping these buried rivers and building plans and visions for positive change. There's actually quite a few communities in the US that have daylighted their rivers. They've brought them back to the surface. It turns out this often makes great financial sense. The savings from the reduction of flooding can make a big impact, but it also improves community health and happiness. It's a win-win. I think daylighting is a remarkable practice in and of itself, but it's also a great metaphor for the work that we do. By mapping invisible categories and connections within our culture, we're able to create environments for understanding that invite action. And I think we've got both the opportunity and the responsibility to serve as architects of change. I'd like to close with a story. Back in September, I went hiking in the Grand Canyon, rim to rim. And when I was deep in the canyon, I'm walking along and I'm thinking deep thoughts about the 2,000 million year old rocks around me. I'm lost in thought when suddenly I hear a rattle. I nearly stepped on this rattlesnake. Now, this is the second photo I took. First one was a little blurry because my hands were shaking. So I spent the next hour of my hike sort of high on adrenaline. I came across a sign about rattlesnakes that said, when they're rattling, you don't necessarily need to be afraid. That does not mean that they're ready to strike. It's their way of avoiding conflict, of saying, hey, I'm here, watch out. At first I thought, yeah, right. I've sort of had a lifetime of movies and books that have sort of demonized these vicious creatures. But as it sunk in, my attitude changed. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say I have empathy for rattlesnakes. Don't really understand them, but I feel like I have a better understanding, and I actually feel a little protective of them now. Perhaps there are some rattlesnakes in your organizational ecosystem, some folks who you're scared of, who you avoid. Well, maybe it's worth working towards a better understanding. Maybe it's worth engaging, because we're all in this together. We're all in the same circle. So, to wrap up, the architecture of understanding is about integrating categories and connections and culture. And if we're creative and courageous in these acts of synthesis, we can change how we think and what we want. The work that we do changes everything, because everything is deeply intertwingled. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you for your attention.